Hi everybody, Professor Gassimi here, and in this lecture, I'm going to be giving you an overview of the second homework assignment for the Web Application Development course. Now, recall that in the first assignment, and for the last several weeks in the semester, we've been going over front-end development. And what this assumes is that we really only have to think about the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. As long as we have a mechanism, a backend, that can take those, wrap them, and send them to our client, we don't have to think about anything else. All we think about are the pieces that get shipped to the client. Well, when you start to do back-end development work, you're having a shift in perspective. You're not only thinking about what's going to be sent to the client, but specific things you might want to do to those HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files before you send them to the client. You might want to enable interactivity or make certain components of those files depend on attributes of your user, as an example. And so what this homework, as well as some of the lectures that we will be doing in the coming weeks, are going to introduce you to is these elements of back-end development. Okay? This assignment specifically is going to give you some hands-on experience with what I think are the three major components to introduce you to back-end development. The first is to get used to a back-end framework of some kind. In the case of this course, we're using Python Flask. The second thing is to get used to using databases. They could be relational or non-relational. For this assignment, we're going to be using a relational database, which is MySQL. And the last thing is to get used to templating tools that make it easier to generate dynamic HTML content. And the tool that we will be using for that specifically is called Jinja. Okay, now before we begin this assignment, just like we've done in other homeworks, there's a couple of standard housekeeping things that you'll want to do. The first is you're going to update your local copy of the course materials repository. You're going to do that by issuing a git pull to gitlab.msu.edu/CSE477 spring 2022 coursematerials.git. And you should have access to all the course materials then. After you've pulled the latest copy here, you can compose the homework container that's shipped with it. So we've done this before in homework 0 and homework 1. You navigate to the appropriate directory. You run the docker compose command. Difference here is that we're composing the homework 2 object instead of the homework 1 object. And then you can visit your website online. And in fact, what I'm showing here is the template application on the right-hand side that I'm going to ship with you. The template application is very bare bones intentionally, but it's actually a fully functional website with front-end and back-end capabilities that I think will give you a nice starting point as you do your own development. Okay, so actually I think what would be nice is for us to take a few minutes to explore this template that I'm sending to you on the right-hand side, and then we're going to jump to the actual code, and I'm going to try to call out specific components of the code that map to what you see on the right-hand side. So let's do first a quick overview. You can see here I'm on localhost, so 0.0.0.0:8080, and I'm at /home. That's the root I'm at. And this is a very bare bones web page that says a little bit about me and has two links, one to home, which just redirects me right here, and one to a resume tab, which I click, and it gives a very extraordinarily bare bones resume for me. It says Michigan State University instructor. Okay, so this is the basic template that gets shared with you. Now, but you might also notice that if I keep clicking this home page, you might notice that fun fact at the bottom. You see it? It's changing actually. Sometimes it says I have a pet sparrow. Other times it says I write poetry. And every time I click it, something will change there. Okay, well, that's because this component of the web page that you're seeing down here is being dynamically generated every time I visit the page, as is actually a huge amount of what you're seeing on these web pages that I've stepped you through in this template. So without further ado, what I'm going to do here real quick is I'm going to move this README, which you will have access to through the homework itself, off screen. And what I'd like to show you are the various components of the template that's going to be sent to you so that you know how to navigate it. The one I'd like to start with is routes.py. Okay, let me minimize some of these folders just so that it's easier for you to have less clutter and you know where things are. Okay, so I'm in the main Flask app. This is what gets shipped with your homework when you pull it. And you can see there's a bunch of directories here. And in the Flask app, there is routes.py. Okay, if you click this routes.py, you can see there's a very short file here, right? But there's some structure. The structure basically goes, you have an app.route, and then it's always followed by a functional definition. What this app.route does is it controls the behavior of the website when a user visits that directory. In the case of /, that's the root directory. That would be if we came over here to the website and we did just 8080. That's what it does. Now, interestingly, you can see when I typed in 8080, it sent me to /home. Well, it did that because you can see in the function definition underneath that, the instructions were to return, redirect, home. This redirect is something that is packaged with Flask, in addition to a couple of other things that I've imported here at the top. I've also, as I've shipped this template, tried to give you everything that I used when I was creating the solution for the assignment from a library's perspective. What that means is that you may not have to use every one of these things I imported, but I doubt you will have to import more than what I've put up here. So if you get stuck or you don't know how to do something for whatever reason, some of the things in the library headers might give you some hints. Okay, so notice that when I'm on home here on the right-hand side, we already spoke about this fun fact that was changing, right? I started university when I was a wee lad, and when I refreshed the page here, it was changing. Remember, I have a pet sparrow and so on. Well, the way this is happening is you can see in this function definition that controls what happens when I visit that route /home, which corresponds to here, /home, is I actually pull a random string from a list of strings here. And you probably recognize these from the fun fact that was showing up at the bottom of the page there. And I then return a rendered template. The template I'm rendering is home.html. And I give a fun fact variable that's passed in. That's the X here. So what is a template exactly, right? Well, in the last assignment, you were placing all these static HTML files in the templates directory. What I'd like to do is take a couple of minutes now, and let's look through some of the templates that I've shipped with the web application so you can understand actually why they are called templates as opposed to regular HTML files in the context of Flask. So I've opened the HTML templates directory here, and you can see there's a subdirectory shared that contains a file layout. Then there's a home, and there is a resume.html file. So we're looking on the right-hand side at home.html. So I think it's probably most natural for us to open that one up first. So let's do that together. Okay, here it is. Here's home.html. Now, if you compare the code that you have on the left-hand side, I'll zoom in so that you can see it. If you compare the code that you have on the left-hand side there and the rendered web page on the right-hand side, you can see the correspondence, right? There is, here's the H1, here's the H1, there's a bunch of text, there's some new lines that are created by the breaks, and so on and so forth. And hey, I have the fun fact here. But notice that there's also some odd syntax in this document that distinguishes it from a regular old HTML document. The first striking thing is that we don't have an HTML tag at the top. We also don't have a head. We don't have any of that information, right? Clearly there was some very minimal styling here because the background is black and the text is white and so on, but none of that is indicated anywhere in this document. Well, the reason is because we're using something called Jinja in order to take a basic layout document and to basically plug what you see here as a component into that basic layout document. The way you can recognize Jinja parts within an HTML template is by these tags. You see the percentage followed by the opening or closing squiggly brace. These are the indications that you're seeing Jinja. Or if you see a double brace like we have down here. In the case of the double brace, this is what retrieves a variable that's passed in from your Flask application. So if we come back to routes, you can see that we had a variable fun facts, which was pulled from this list, right over here. And what happens is when we render the template home.html, we're passing that variable in here. If we come back, we can then indicate where exactly we want that variable that was randomly pulled to be injected into the HTML time when the client receives it and renders it. Okay, that's how we're getting it passed in. It's through this Jinja functionality, which is specified by curly braces. Now, what I'd like to do as well here is take you through some of the other elements of Jinja that are going to be important as you work on the homework. Within here, there's two things that, beyond this variable, that Jinja is able to do. Let's talk about the first one. The first one we have here at the top says extends shared/layout.html. Well, here on the left-hand side, if we look in the folder, we do have a folder shared, and we do have a file layout.html. And what this says is that what you see here is something that builds on the structure of layout.html. So let's open up layout.html together. Aha! Layout.html is a proper HTML document. Look, there's the HTML tags. We have a header, just like we've seen before. We have a body, and so on and so forth. What you might notice is that all the pieces in this website, like CSE 477 Homework 2, that didn't show up in home.html are accounted for in layout.html. Okay? But how do we know where the content of home.html, that's this stuff, goes with respect to layout.html? How do we choose where it gets plugged in? Well, that's where this block main content start and end tag come into play. Okay? When you have a block and then a name here, this is a name that you assign, followed by an end block, what it does is it cuts all the content in this block and pastes it into the corresponding location within the template that's extended on up here. So it's as though I grabbed all this code and I cut it and I opened up layout.html and I came down here to where main content was and I pasted it right in there. And that's what ultimately gets rendered. And you can see that I have multiple of these, right? I have one for extra CSS that I might need on a given page, because I may not want to just do this for home.html. I might want to do it for piano.html. I may want to do it for projects.html or 500 other things, but I don't want to have to keep rewriting my header. I don't want to have to keep rewriting my nav bar and a bunch of other stuff that's static, like the footer, right? So what's really wonderful about laying out your files this way is that you only focus on, in a document like home.html, the piece of this that's unique to the home document. Or within resume.html, you only focus on the piece that's unique to the resume. Okay? Now, I'd like to sort of close the loop or close the thought process on layout.html, and then I would like to open up resume.html. And I'm going to talk about, which is what we have open here. I'd like to talk through some of the Jinja elements there that you should be aware of as you do the assignment. Okay, so let's come back to this layout.html. We spoke about these block components, right, when we looked at home.html and its relationship to layout.html. Okay, so I think we've covered everything here. There shouldn't be anything else that is mysterious with respect to these Jinja elements. One thing that we haven't mentioned here, and I'm going to open the screen a little bit so you can see it, is that when we are trying to reference style sheets or scripts or other such things, there is a way that you do that in Flask so that if you have routes that are deeper than just one level, so if we had /home/ I don't know, project /piano, if we chose to structure our application that way, so that you don't have problems indexing the static directory. In brief, the way you do that is you always wrap the particular location of a file you want to import in this Jinja syntax. You open up the two curly braces, you do URL for, you indicate static. It will kind of allocate or recalibrate you to the static directory, and then you tell it where within static you want to grab the files. If you don't do this, then as you create within your Flask application, routes.py, if I did /home/ I don't know, let's do hook, okay? If I save this and I come back to /home, which you're going to see here real quick because it's going to die. It says I don't find this. Well, because we destroyed /home, right? Now if I come /home and do /hook, you can see it's there. It's still there, right? Because all I had to do was change the mapping that I wanted here for this particular function call that pulled the random variable and generated and so on and so forth. Okay, so there is a correspondence here. But the reason why in layout.html, let me correct this real quick and put this back to home. Okay, the reason why in layout.html we have this when we're importing the CSS as well as the JavaScript is basically to account for that relative path when you're doing things. Okay, so that's the only other thing I want to point out about the layout that you should keep in mind and in general as you're doing work on Flask applications. Okay, great. So we've gone over home, we've gone over layout. What I'd like to go over next is resume.html. Okay, so let's open this. Well, what you can see is there's some components of this that you probably recognize. Well, hey, look, there's the extends. We know it extends layout.html. So that means we're going to take this block of content, main content, we're going to cut it, and we're going to come plop it here in this block main content at the time when we render it. Great. Okay, but there's some other elements in here that you've not yet seen. We will also be going over these in the lecture, but I think it's worth touching on here as well. The first is here, we've clearly got some Jinja. We know that why? Because we've got the percentage sign and a squiggly brace, as you can see here. And this is showing up in multiple locations. Okay, well, what this Jinja syntax does is it allows you to kind of write something like Python within the HTML template. More specifically, it allows you to take data that you pass in, like this resume data object, and to kind of do things with it like you would do with Python. In this case, I'm iterating through this resume data. It's a dict, so I'm able to take the key and the value. And then in this case, I am saying I want to, for each of the elements within that dictionary that's been passed in, within resume data, I want to print one of the properties in that dictionary called name. And then as long as there is a position that's in that dictionary, I'd like to print the position in another title. And it's this code, this Jinja code, that's allowing me actually to, when I click the resume, to get Michigan State University, which is H1, and instructor, which is H2 level. Okay? What I'd like to do is now take you real quick back to routes.py, and I'd like to explain how this is happening, right? Because I didn't write Michigan State University anywhere in here. I didn't write instructor anywhere in here. I'm clearly getting it from routes.py somehow. So let's go look at resume.html. That's this piece here. Okay, so we know from here that this maps to what we see up here. Check, that's easy. The first thing that we have in this file is resume data equals, and then we have db.getResumeData. Okay, well, this db function is initialized up here, db equals database. And the database comes from a local utility that I started and that you will finish in this homework in utils, database, database, import database. Let's come here on the left-hand side and find where that is so we can understand this first line of code and how it works. Okay, so we have here under utils, we have database, and then we have the database file, and there it is, it's open. Okay, there is a class in here, database, and it does a couple of things. It initializes a database, it allows you to run queries, and it allows you to get some information. And we're going to come back actually to this file and speak about those pre-built components that I've got in here in a minute. So let's just glaze down and try to find the function that was being called. In this case, here it is. It's that get resume data. And what you can see is that this is returning just a long dict, right? A nested dict. We have 1 colon, and then we're giving the address of and the city and the state and department of some institution. In this case, it was Michigan State University. And then we list some positions that were held within Michigan State University. In this case, we can see the title of that first position is instructor. Aha, that's where we got it from here on the right-hand side. We basically passed in this nested dictionary, and we used for loops and if statements to kind of iterate through it, grab pieces and plug them into HTML documents, right? So it's pretty neat. Okay, so that's what this line does here. Okay, I also happen to print this to my console. So if you saw code like getting printed here, like you have down here in the console, that's where it comes from. Okay, it's just I printed it to my console as I was working on this. And the last thing we do is we render the template, in this case resume.html, which you saw was right here. And we plugged in what? We plugged in the resume data. That was what we just pulled from that function. And then as you saw, resume.html has the Jinja scripts that allow us to iterate through and print these 2 items that you see on the screen. Okay, so with that, I think what we've done is we've gone through all the templates and we've gone through all the routes in routes.py. There's a couple of other things that I'd like to take you through just so that you feel comfortable with this template that's been shipped to you and you can start to do the extensions to it that are necessary for the homework assignment. There is a static directory that I've shipped here. This static directory doesn't contain everything from your first assignment. You will populate it with the elements of your first assignment that are relevant for this second assignment, okay? So you can see, in this case, I've just got a main folder. There's one CSS file. There's a favicon, which I give instructions at the bottom of the assignment on how to create. And there's a little bit of JavaScript, okay? So this stuff you're already familiar with, and I'm going to just pass it over. Now, you might notice that we did go through the utility very briefly, or rather a part of the utility, but what we did not do is we didn't open up this folder. So I'd like to open up first this database folder that you see here and talk about the contents of it. After we've talked about the contents of that, we're going to jump back to that database utility that we were looking at, okay? And the reason is this database folder is simpler, I think, and if you understand the stuff in here, it'll make the utility a little easier. Okay, you can see there's 2 subdirectories here. There's create tables and there's initial data. So let's open up the create tables one. You can see that there's 2 files. There's institutions.sql and positions.sql. Okay, well, what these are meant to do is they are sort of the definitions of the tables that we want to create when we first generate our web app. So if, for example, you launch this to Google Cloud, your Docker image is not going to come just pre-built with all the tables kind of ready to go. You'll need to use SQL to install or kind of create those tables that you're going to use to manage your data. Okay, and in this case, I'm showing you the definition for one of those tables that was used to render here. You see the institution. Well, that was pulled from this institutions table. Okay, and you can see it contains a create table statement with the table name, and then the definitions of each of the columns, the type, default values if necessary, a comment, and a definition of the primary key, as well as a comment on the table itself. Some of this stuff about SQL we're going to go through in more detail within the lecture, but I just wanted to show you here an example of a create table statement. We have one for both institutions as well as positions. And the positions information is where I would have pulled this instructor from, okay? So that's what's in this first one, the create tables. The second thing is in this initial data. And basically you'll see that for each of the SQL files that were here, institutions and positions, these 2 here, I also have 2 CSV files. And these basically provide the data that I want to port into those 2 tables after I've created them. So I would want to execute, for example, institutions.sql in a query. So I generate this table, and then I want to plug all the data that I have specified here in this CSV into that table. And I'd like to do that when I start up the app so that I have all the data ported. Okay, so if you understand these, now it's going to be clear what some of the elements of that database utility are there for and what they mean. So let's jump to the database utility again now. So here under utils, database, database.py, let's open this up. And I'm going to take you through, there are 3 functions that I have defined here, which I'm going to take you through. And then I'm going to highlight some of the ways that you can use this database utility to query what exists within the database. Okay. So the first thing we have here is init, and this just has the database configuration information. So if you were building and deploying one of these, by the way, you would never want to share this, obviously, because access to this kind of information could compromise your database and so on. But this is for learning purposes, so I'm obviously showing you. You have here something hosted on this localhost machine. You have a user, a port, and a password that you use to connect to the database instance from within Python using the MySQL connector library. Okay, you don't need to worry or think about this. Just take it for granted that there are connections that are being made between your database and your Python application, so they can speak to each other. You can run queries and so on. Okay, the second thing here is this query function. And effectively what this does is it creates a connection to the database. That's what this does. You can see I'm passing in the host, user, password, port, database, and character set. And then depending on whether parameters were passed in, some parameters, so is this a query that basically is just a string, or is this a query that has a %s character on it? If we come back to the documentation, just so I can be clear what I mean by that, if you wrote a query like this, db.querySelect cure date, it's just a string. If you wrote a query like this, select star from skills where name equals %s, you might want to pass in a parameter. So this query functionality allows you to do both, what I've written, and you're welcome to use this or extend it if you want for the purposes of interacting with the database in your web application. Okay, so I'm going to jump past this and go to the third thing I included. This one's actually not necessary for your homework, but in case you're interested in understanding the information schema, which is sort of the metadata within your database's ecosystem, you can call this about function within Python. You could print it to the screen and you'd get all of the interesting metadata, like what are all the tables in the database, what are the column names, what are the keys, whether they're primary or foreign keys, what are the comments on the columns, and so on and so forth. So this is just for your curiosity and edification. You don't have to call it at any point in the assignment if you don't want to. You'll also see there's 3 functions down here. These are the 3 you will actually be filling out in the homework, so we're going to come back to those in a little bit. Okay? Great. So I think what we've done at this point is we've actually taken you through the entire template. So just to recap, let's come over here. You can see we had let me minimize these so it's a little easier to see. We had an app.py. You actually don't need to think about this one for now. So we had routes.py. We took you through all of this. We took you through the static directory, which I think you know all about anyway. We took you through templates, including the base template, layout.html, and the things that extended that template. We took you through this database folder that contained the SQL statements to create some tables we were interested in, institutions.sql and positions.sql. And then we took you through some of the initial data that we were going to use to populate that. And finally, we took you through the database utility here. Okay, so that's the whole template web application. It works out of the box. You can see I'm running it here on the right-hand side, and it's all good to go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull back up the assignment criteria, because we've effectively gone through this review here. Okay, the exploring of the template subdirectories, we've done that together. You're also welcome, of course, to read through this if you're the kind of person who prefers to read rather than watch a video. Now let's switch to the assignment's goals. Okay, your high-level goal in the assignment is to take that professional web page that you started in homework 1, and you're going to build on it. You're going to extend it. And you're going to extend it in 3 ways. The first way is you're going to add a database. Okay. The second way is you're going to take that resume page that you had. Remember, in the nav bar, you could click resume and it gave you a PDF. we're going to switch that to a HTML version of it that's generated using Jinja, very similar to what you've seen in this very basic template. And the third thing you're going to do is you're going to create a feedback form that people can type into this feedback form. It will store those results in your database somewhere, and then you can visualize or just see a simple printout of all the contents of that feedback form. Okay? Just as you had in previous assignments, we're going to have a set of general requirements we'd like you to follow, as well as a set of specific requirements we'd like you to follow. I'm going to detail and step you through all of those below. Okay? So let's come here to first the general requirements. You should be aware of these from the last couple of assignments. Please do keep your code commented, organized, and thoughtfully structured. If not for me, do it for yourself, because if you choose to actually take what you build in this class and you want to extend it for a web application you want to build on your own, if you want to use this as your own personal website for the foreseeable future, trying to do a good quality job on keeping your code organized and structured, you'll thank yourself in the future. The second thing is, as we've mentioned before, please don't mix your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript in single files. It's much better to keep those separate. You will thank yourself in the future if you keep those separated. The last thing is, and this is not something we had discussed in previous assignments, is that your SQL tables should use foreign keys when it's appropriate, meaning if you have a many-to-one relationship between two tables, the table that's on the many side of that many-to-one relationship should have a foreign key to the table that's on the one side of the many-to-one relationship. Okay? And you should always comment the rows in your tables, as well as place a comment at the table level, as I did in those two templates I gave you with the assignment. Okay? So you can use those to get kind of a hint for what I'm looking for. If you don't deviate from that, you should be fine. I have, of course, included very specific requirements with respect to the grading in the assignment rubric, just like I did in the last assignment. So if you're curious how the points are going to be calculated for this assignment, you can come here, you can read through it, and go wild. You can see everything I'm thinking about from a grading perspective. Okay, great. Now let's get to the specific requirements for this. What I'd like to do is just pause momentarily, because I'd actually like to pull up, by navigating my directory here to the solution, I actually like to launch the solution web application. This is one of the reasons, by the way, you're going to see that I really love Docker. It's so quick to shift between web applications. So let me come over here to my solutions directory. Let's go to homework 2. Okay. And now we're here. Okay, now let me go ahead and run the same thing. And there we go. It looks like we're up. So, hey, that was it, right? I switched from the template to the actual one. Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here, and I'm going to come back to home. Okay, well, this looks familiar, right? This is what we all did together in the first homework assignment. But there's some important differences here between the first assignment and the second assignment. And I'm going to try to visually step you through what those are. Notice, first of all, that everything here works the same way it did before. I can click projects, I can go to the piano, I can type here, right? I can do all sorts of stuff. That's great. Okay? So, but there's some critical differences. The first one is, you might notice that every page I go to, there's a feedback button here. You see that? It's floating here on the left-hand side. Well, that's the third requirement for the assignment, okay? It's this feedback button. Basically, when we click it, you can see this little box pops up. And as I move my screen, that box just doesn't want to go away, right? It follows me around unless I click this again to make it go away. And it doesn't matter which page I go to. If I go to projects and I click feedback, it also pops up. And again, as I scroll up and down, it just stays there. What this allows me to do is enter my name, my email, and my feedback. And I can plop it here and say, my name is Mohammed Qasimi. My email is, desk@gmail.com. And then I can go, yada, yada, yada. And I can paste this. I can click send. And I see, hey, thanks for your feedback. Here's what others had to say. And maybe I come here and I'm really zealous and I put some feedback again. and I put, some other stuff like this. I click send, and oh, there it is. Look, it showed up. Both of the points of feedback showed up in this form. That's pretty neat, right? Okay, and now note that if I navigate away from this page, I go to home, I click here again, I do this a third time, oh, it shows up again, okay? So the point here is that this information is persisting in your database. That feedback functionality is one of the requirements you'll be working on. Okay, another one of the requirements that you will be working on is developing the resume. Okay, so if I click here on the resume, well, hey, notice that it didn't just throw me to a PDF. I got this nice HTML page now. And this HTML page is styled so that I have, this isn't my complete CV, but obviously, but I've got some components here, right? There's Michigan State University. I'm a researcher here. I do stuff at the interface of AI and healthcare. And hey, here's a link to, a cool paper that I did and a description of it. And there's times and all this other sorts of stuff that's built into the page. I have different sections for each of the institutions I've worked at and positions I've held and so on. Now, backing obviously all of this up, both the feedback button as well as the resume functionality, which are the two major things you're actually working on, the feedback and the resume. Backing both of those up is a database. That's the reason that we can, we're storing this information here somewhere and pulling it and rendering it, and we're doing the same with the feedback button, okay? Well, that's why the first specific requirement you have here on the left-hand side in the assignment is getting the database set up, because everything else follows from there. All right. So in order to get the database set up, there's 3 steps. The first one I think is going to be actually pretty straightforward. You're going to basically specify some additional database tables. Okay. Remember we went to the assignment over here. Let me come over here and show you. Hey, we had these create tables, right? We had institutions, we had positions. Well, you're going to come in here and you're going to create 3 more tables: experiences.sql, skills.sql, and feedback.sql. Now note that just creating these files here, .sql files, doesn't create the tables. These aren't being executed just because you put them in the folder. We're going to handle that separately, okay? But you want to put the create table statements in a corresponding SQL file over here. You'll next want to, and this you probably guessed this, you want to create the CSV data to pre-populate it, just like I did here, okay? And after you've done that, that's the second piece, which I also think should be very quick. The third piece, which is the involved part of this database component, is extending the database utility. Now that's the file that we had over here, right? Let's come to the utility, open up database.py. That's this thing, okay? And you may have noticed I took you through the first 3 functions, and I told you we were going to come back and revisit these. Let's create tables, insert rows, and get resume data. Okay, well, here's what you're going to do. You're going to come in and you're going to build out the code that goes in these 3 places, in these 3 functions specifically. In create tables, you're going to basically call all of these SQL files. You're going to import them and run them. That's it. So you're going to execute them as a query and you will create them. You're then going to take the data that's available in these files, import, read them, and insert them into the database to pre-populate it, okay? That's what the first function here, let me come back down. That's what create tables should be doing. So I think that one will be pretty straightforward. This create tables is not only for here, but for other purposes, going to need to insert rows, right? It's going to need to insert some data into a table. And so separately, I want you to write a function, insert rows, that you can have your create tables call or not call, but you'll have to create it either way. And what this should do is you specify a table that you want to insert data into. You specify a set of columns in that table. Okay, X and Y is just an example. And then you designate a list of lists that say what the row values are that map to these column values. And what this should do is generate the query that gets executed to insert all of that data into the database. So that's what create tables does, and that's what insert rows does. Okay, so let's assume for the sake of the discussion today that you got these 2 done and they were straightforward and they were easy. The third thing you'll want to do then is you're going to create a query that pulls data from your database. Now that there's stuff in it, right? It does the join operations, which we're going to cover in the lectures, how you do joins and so on, to put your data into a unified format and to format that unified data so that it looks like what you're seeing here, right? Hey, there's that dict of dicts that we saw before, right? You hierarchically organize it as a document like this from the tabular view that's available from a SQL table or a set of SQL tables into a single view like this that you can use for some other purpose. Okay, that's the three components of the database part of this. Okay, if you get those three, you're done with all the database stuff. Now let's go to the second set of requirements. These are the resume page requirements. Okay, so for this portion, you're going to write code that generates a dynamic HTML version of the resume. Well, that's this, right? We are looking at it right now. I plop in some, I pull in some data object, and I use Jinja, for loops, if statements, and so on to write the corresponding pieces of HTML dynamically to generate a beautiful document like this, okay? I've included here on the left-hand side some of the specific instructions that you should keep in mind, like, hey, for each institution, display the name. For each affiliated position, display the title, the start date, end date, the responsibilities, and so on and so forth. So you can read through that instead of me narrating it. One thing I'd like you to be mindful of as you generate this is styling. I'm not going to force you to style it like I've shown you here on the right because, I'd have to practically hand you the CSS file if I wanted you to style it this way. And I don't think that's a good way for you to learn by me just handing you a CSS file. I'd like you to do the CSS styling, and I will give you some creative liberty, but please be thoughtful. Your resume should be easy to read. So as long as you've structured it in a way where it's clear where the partitions are, it's clear what the subdivisions are, that's fine. You're good. There's no absolute styling constraints, but we want you to be thoughtful to a person that's looking at the resume so they can digest some of the information. Okay. Another thing you'll want to be careful of is we are going to check when you display information that if some fields are null, okay, I've got an example here. I put it here intentionally. Like this field, the end date was left empty. This is an example of what you don't want to happen. You do not want none to be displayed there. You should replace that with something logical like current, okay, if it says none. Or there might be other instances where, for example, if here I didn't have Michigan, I wouldn't want to do East Lansing, comma, none, right? I'd want to put just East Lansing. Okay, so keep in mind some of those things. I already mentioned this point about denoting the hierarchical relationships, so I don't need to revisit that. Okay, that's this second requirement. Now we have the third requirement, which we already talked about. This is the feedback form. So this feedback form is going to require you to use a form element within HTML. And what I'd like you to do is go to that layout.html. Remember, we touched it over here. Let me just move this over real quick. Let's go back to templates. Layout is in shared. Here's the layout. Okay, great. Well, you can come in here, and because that little feedback box has to persist everywhere on the page, you're obviously going to add it somewhere in here, right? And there's a couple of important properties we want to be within that feedback form. You want it to perform an action. This is specified with an attribute that sends data that's put within the form to process feedback route within your routes.py. You want to send that data via a post request using the method and enc type attributes within your form element. And you want to have your form contain some inputs, a name, an email, a comment, and a button to do the submission. Okay, please also note that as I showed in the demo, the form should be styled such that, let me show you here real quick. As I click it and I scroll up and down, notice the form doesn't go away until I click this again. Okay, it's always centered. I can move this around and, and so on and so forth, right? And it does that, okay? Great. So now let's come down here. I talked about the button that's going to toggle the visibility of the form. That's this. And you're going to need a route within routes.py that takes care of catching the data from the post request You specify that in a route using, after specifying the address, you put comma, methods equals, and then you indicate the method you're going to use. In this case, it's a post request. And then within the definition, you can grab the contents of the form by request.form. And then the contents of that form request will be in feedback. You can print that initially to see what comes out the other side. Okay. You'll take that, you will put it in your database, then call the database to get the total cumulative contents of all feedback, display that to the user, and you're done. The last optional component of the assignment will be to create a favicon for your website. That's the thing that shows up here on the top left. Okay, that's optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. And after that, you will submit your homework 2 code using Git. You will deploy your web application to Google Cloud. And finally, you will submit the homework 2 survey. That's it. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions. I hope that this overview of the assignment is helpful and makes it easier for you to do the learning part of this and less time sort of trying to figure out what some of these templates mean.